Hi, welcome to a tutorial on particles. As you can see, I've got an example scene here. Go ahead and click play on my flipbook. Okay, why flipbook? Okay. As you can see, I've got my particles flowing from the top of the screen to the bottom, acting like snow. Let's go ahead and recreate this. First thing I'm going to do is go ahead and make this a new scene, delete everything. Now we'll go ahead and create our viewport by pressing 1 with the background selected. And the first thing we're going to do is set our project. I've already got it set. Our output resolution is going to be HD 720. But as you can see, our background is currently in HD 1080. So we'll go ahead and fix that by tabbing in our reformat node. And that adjusts the background to match our correct output. Particles are part of the 3D system within Nuke. So we're going to be working in the 3D view. To work in this view, there's 3 things that we need. The first thing we're going to need is a camera node. This way we can actually see the particles. We're going to need a scene node to connect our particles to and any other 3D geometry that we might happen to use. And we're going to need a render so we can move our 3D scene into our 2D comp. So let's type in a scan line renderer. Now to get these to work, you're going to need to connect the camera to the camera connection. And then you're going to need to connect the object or scene connector to the scene node. And then to actually make these work, we're going to press M to bring in a merge node. We're going to connect the A pipe to the renderer and the B pipe to the reformat node. Now let's go ahead and get some particles in the scene. We're going to tab in a particle emitter. And that creates our emitter. We'll go ahead and connect it to the scene. And as you can see, we have a vertical line that our emitter is creating from the origin. This is not going to help us because we're doing snow. We need them to fall from the top of the frame down to the bottom, not rise from the origin to the very top. And another issue is that they're right on top of the camera. The camera can't even see these right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is move the camera backwards. That should be good. The first thing I need to do is set the viewport to look at the scanline render so we can see our particles. Now if you look at the particles, we have 3 different connections. We have the particle connector, the emit connector, and the merge connector. The particle connector is going to determine the shape of the particles that we're emitting from. So if I were to tab in a sphere and connect it to the particle, our particles are now in the shape of spheres. And in order to make this a little easier for the computer, I'm going to decrease the resolution of the spheres from 30 and 30 with the rows and columns to 10 and 10. And they're still rising vertically, so another thing we're going to have to do is import a card node, which is going to create a 3D card, which is pretty similar to an image plane, or a plane in Maya without anything on it. And then we're going to connect that to the emit node so the particles emit from it. As you can see, our particles are now emitting towards our camera. If we go to our 2D view and hit play, you're going to see they're charging towards us. That is not what we want. If we were traveling through a vortex or something, that would be fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into our 3D view with our card selected, hold down Command to bring up a rotate tool, and rotate them to where the particles are being emitted downward. Since we'll go ahead and fine tune it, rotate in X, and then we don't need any rotations in Y and Z. There we go. Now they're emitting downward. Let's go back to frame 1. Let's go ahead and increase the size of our card. I'm going to increase it in the X and Z axis. Cards don't have any depth, and the Z-axis is the one that's pointing downwards, so we'll increase the horizontal and the vertical. We'll make it 5 by 5. There we go. Now we'll raise the card off the ground and push it a little bit to the right. Let's go to our particle emitter. As you can see, we have plenty of options here. Display, this affects what's viewed in the viewport. I'm going to turn the display off and you can see my particles disappear. If I set it to wireframe and I zoom in, you can see the wireframe on the particles. Got the wireframe of our sphere because that's the shape we have connected to the particle connector. Solid is just going to show solid objects. Solid and wireframe, it's really hard to see, but there's a wireframe. It's showing the wireframe as well as the individual object. Textured, if I were to have a texture onto the sphere, it would show up on the particles as well. As you can see here, it has our background image on the spheres now. Not really going to help us, but it's good for an example. I'll go ahead and delete that. Actually, I need this to show you something else, because we also have textured and wireframe. Now we have not only our texture, but it's also showing the wireframe for the particles as well. Unchanged, it's basically that final result. Go ahead and delete that since we don't need it anymore. And render is basically the same exact thing, only it's when we write out the actual comp and not what we see in the viewport. The start at, this indicates the start frame of our simulation. Currently it starts one frame before the actual project. Since we need the snow to already be falling, I'm going to go ahead and decrease it to -60. We can always change this later if we find out that it doesn't start early enough. Our emission rate, this controls how much our particles are emitting. The higher I set it, the more spheres are getting projected out, or getting pushed out from the card. If I set it too high, it's going to become like a solid white mass, and it's really bogging down my computer. Let's set it back down. Let's go ahead to about 40 for now. The rate variation, this gives a little bit of randomness to how often the particles are emitted. We'll go ahead and increase this to 6 for now. Max lifetime, this influences how many frames the particles are alive. The higher I set this, the longer they'll live. As you can see now, they're stopping right there. If I go ahead and increase the max lifetime, they now last for a lot longer. So we've got particles from earlier frames now falling as well. We'll go ahead and decrease that back. We'll adjust that once we get our velocity set. And then max lifetime range provides a little bit of variation with how long the particles live. As you can see, they're changing as I slide it. This way, some live longer than others. Velocity controls how fast the particles are falling. So if I were to decrease it, notice how it compresses. They're not traveling as far. Now, if I increase the velocity range, it adds a little bit of randomness to it. As you can see, it looks like it's dancing a little bit. Some are traveling farther than others because they're getting emitted with higher velocity. And since our range is just a little short, I'll go ahead and increase the max lifetime just a little bit more. And then I'll go ahead and move my card upwards just a little bit. And we'll move it backwards just a little. There we go. Now if we look through our 2D view, our snow looks a little bit better, but all our particles are still the same exact size. So we'll go back to our particle emitter. And if you look over here, we have our size and size range sliders. If I go ahead and decrease the size, it makes our particles smaller. We want it to be just a little bigger than that, so about right there ought to be good. And size range provides a little bit of randomness with the size of the particles when they're generated. Let's go ahead and increase this value to 3. As you can see, we have large and small. They're a little too large, so I'll decrease it to 2. And this should be fine. Mass and mass range. These influence how our particles are affected by our fields, which we will cover in just a little bit. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and get started with them now. Let's go back to our 2D view. As you can see, we have our particles falling from our card. They're just falling straight and pretty uniform. It's actually kind of boring. So we'll go ahead and move our particle emitter over here. Hold Command, create our little circle to make this a little neater. We'll do the same thing over here. Now let's go ahead and import a field. If we right click and we go to our particles, you can see we have a bunch of fields and other nodes we can bring in. I'm going to bring in a turbulence node, and I'm going to connect it to the particle emitter. Now we don't want too much strength because it's going to make them fly all over the place. For example, if I type in 0.2, as you can see, they are like really spread out here. If I were to make this a solid 1, they're spread out like crazy. We don't want it to be that strong, so I'll set the strength to about 0.04. And then in the z-axis, I'll set it to like 0.02. We'll go ahead and move the card up just a little bit more. We'll go back to our particle emitter, increase the max life just a little bit here. Whoa, that's a lot more than I wanted. About right there looks good. We'll go ahead and decrease the velocity a little bit. Maybe move our camera up just a little bit now. Maybe rotate it up just a little bit. There we go. Let's go back to our emitter. We'll go ahead and decrease the mass just a little bit. And for our mass range, we'll increase it so that there's a little bit of variation with how much our particles are affected by our turbulence field. Let's go ahead and take a look. Maybe rotate our camera just a little bit more. Just a little bit. There we go. Tab to go back into our 2D view. As you can see, we've got a lot more randomness going on. And now they're not falling in a straight line, so that's good. Now let's go ahead and can look at it from our 2D view. As you can see, our snow is on top of our background, but it's a little too solid, and the color is just a little too bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 2 grade nodes. One grade node is going to be set to RGBA, so it affects the alpha channel as well. And the second one is going to be just regular RGB. The reason I have one with RGBA is because if I don't have that, it's going to pretty much burn through our image. The one with the RGBA over here, it's going to affect the transparency because it's also affecting the alpha. One thing you can also do is have it set to where it affects just the alpha and it doesn't do anything. So it has to be RGBA. Let's go ahead and put these back up. Now we'll go ahead and adjust our color a little bit. We'll go ahead and gray the snow just a little bit. Go back to our 2 grades. I'll go to the one that's RGB. Maybe gray it out just a little bit more. Then we'll go to our first one and make it just a little bit transparent here. Like just a little bit where we can barely see through. Yeah, that looks good. Now I'll also go ahead and add in an edge blur so that our particles aren't completely crisp. Just add it to where it's a little bit subtle, like about there. Looks good. Press H, and now let's go back and view it. Alright, that looks good. And the last thing we'll go ahead and add is some motion blur. As you can see, the motion blur is set far too high. We'll decrease the shutter samples by 2. So that it's actually just 2 shutters instead of 3. It will decrease the shutter time so that it's a little bit more solid in between the particles. So they appear a little bit more solid. 0.05. If you find that the values get too precise for your slider, you can always just type in your own values. Like I'm about to do 0.3. This is far too small for me to affect the slider. And now, let's go back to our motion blur, 0.03. Okay, press H. And now we have our shot. So from here, you're going to do a flip book. Hold Option and press F when clicking your merge node. You normally don't want to change any of these values here. The only thing you might want to change is your frame range because it usually pops in it with frames 1 to 1. I'm going to do frames 1 through 50, and I shall get back to y'all when it renders out. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to create a particle cache node. What you're going to use this for is to write out your cache for your particles to make rendering go faster. First thing I'm going to do is click the folder icon here. And then I've already got where I want to save it out preset, so I'm just going to type in a name, snow test, with 4 pound signs. The pound signs are going to be where the numbers and the frames are going to be. Nuke is going to save out some Nuke particle cache files, and each one is going to be numbered for the frame that it corresponds to. Click Open. Then I'm going to click Render. It's going to go ahead and write those files. As you can see, my files are now here. I've got all 101 frames. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and do a flip book. Option F. I'm going to only do frames 1 through 50. Click OK. It's going to generate a flip book with only those particular frames. I'll get back to you guys when it's done. One thing that you can do is if you find that the flip book is generating far too slow for you to see your results, you can click the cancel button once you have enough frames, and then when this warning pops up, click yes. It'll show just the frames you've rendered out. You might get a glitch on the last frame, but you can pretty much see what's going on. As you can see, our snow is indeed falling. It's a little fast, but there is that little bit of randomness to it from the turbulence field, and everything looks pretty much good to go. So I'll just go ahead, go to my particle emitter, decrease the velocity a little bit. Go back to our 3D view. Decrease it by a lot. Increase our max lifetime range from 20 to 30. I'll go ahead and lower the card down just a little bit. Actually, I can't. It's like near the top of the camera's field of view. I can move it down just a little bit. Alright, yeah, that should be good. Go to the turbulence. Maybe decrease this about by half. Yeah, that looks good. Maybe rotate our camera up just slightly. Just a little bit. It's too much down. There we go. Now we'll go to our card and rotate it just slightly. There. Let's go back to our 2D view. Play through a couple frames. And our snow is falling a little bit slower, which is exactly what we wanted. We'll go ahead and do one more flip book. But before I do, I'm going to go ahead and save the scene. Go to my final merge, Option F, hit OK. Wait for it to render out about 10 to 15 frames, 20 at the most, for the sake of this podcast. One of the things you can do during the waiting time for this is like get yourself something to drink, get yourself a snack, maybe watch a few commercials or some short videos on YouTube or something. And once it finishes, you can go ahead and take a look at your results. I'm going to go ahead and cancel this, click yes. And the snow looks much better. Now if it would stop for a second, go ahead and scrub through. And that concludes my tutorial on particles. I hope you guys learned something from this, and I shall see you in my next video.